Hi, everybody. This is Meilin Obinata. On today's Talk of the Bay, we're exploring the role of recalls and censures in electoral politics. First, I'm welcoming Raul Urena, the former mayor of Calexico, California, a border town. Raul was elected into office with over 70% of the vote, but later thus was the subject of a successful recall campaign by the Republican Party, which weaponized Ureña's gender identity, as Raul was the first transgender mayor of Calexico. I'm also speaking with Peter Salai, a voter who shares his thoughts about the censure and recall attempt of Salinas City Council member Andrew Sandoval. Peter is someone who doesn't necessarily agree with Sandoval's social media posts, but opposes the censure, and we learn a little bit about his civic engagement journey. Raul, thank you for joining me today on Talk of the Bay on KOSQD, and I'm just very curious to know about your whole journey in politics. So, could you let us know the public offices that you have held?
Yes, my name is Raul Urena, and ever since the election in 2020, when Biden came into office, that election I was elected by an overwhelming majority of 71%, highest vote count in Calexico's history, to the Calexico City Council, where I served all the way up until the recall of April 2024 after a successful re-election campaign in 2022.
Thank you. And what was motivating you to run for that seat?
It was a very special time when roughly around when the pandemic started. In March, I was still here at UC Santa Cruz, and a couple of my best friends, mentors, Daniela Flores and Luis Flores, who is now a UC Berkeley sociology professor, were starting this movement in Imperial County centered around protecting Imperial Valley essential workers and specifically farm workers in what was, and throughout the pandemic, one of the highest death rates of COVID in the entire state. And that was during the summer. That was an immediate call that as soon as I graduated, I had to go back home and I had to represent my community because they were dying, and they were dying in a very discriminatory way, rooted in environmental racism.
What was it? What was your campaign like? Or what
My
was the experience like of running for office as someone who has just graduated from college?
When I graduated, I remember I got on the plane roughly around the time when my lease ended, I think like in August. I got off the plane and my parents picked me up at the Imperial El Centro Airport. And I said, Mom, Dad, like I really have to run for office. Just 3 days before the deadline, I said, there's this guy, Morris Risen, who's been there forever, has had 4 campaigns, and is going to go unchallenged. And I can't just let this man go unchallenged when he doesn't care about what's going on. And my parents said, yes, absolutely, let's go. And that was it. I ran a campaign with zero door knocking because it was obviously the campaign. During that campaign, very notably, conservatives hacked my Instagram account and put out pictures of myself in a dress when I was in college and experimenting with my gender identity. And of course, said that I was a jobless prostitute coming back into town. And I still managed to win that election. But ever since the beginning, my gender and my sexual identity, at least in my hometown, has always been the center of attack. That's kind of where the story starts.
So, for obviously, this is radio. Maybe you could explain to us what is your gender identity and sexuality?
Yes, I identify as a gender fluid person. I'm currently, or starting, after so many years, seeking to start hormone therapy with estrogen so that I can become more feminine. I'm described also as a transgender woman. Some people use those terms, or those are acceptable, and I'm just simply a bisexual person. I'm characterized by having relatively long hair, which to me is enough to be the kind of woman I want to be. I wear lipsticks. During my mayorship, I wore, of course, dresses in my elected office as well. And I think those are like the most complete descriptors of who I am, gender wise.
So once you were in office, what were you trying to work on and trying to get, I guess, I'm assuming cooperation from other council members?
Well, during the first 2 years, which were the pandemic, 2020, 21, 22, the primary focus was the whole vaccine hoax that the Republicans had, the controversy, which is they were downplaying the public health impacts that were being experienced in our farm worker community. Imperial County was a county that didn't get a break during the pandemic. It is at least 70, 80% essential workers. And so the primary focus was that. And we were in a minority in those 2 years. Luckily, even with our advocacy, we brought Calexico to be one of the highest vaccinating rates early on in the pandemic. We addressed several racial disparities because early on, when we started vaccinations in Imperial County, they were shifting towards the more white and affluent neighborhoods. So we effectively corrected that through our advocacy, push back against the mask bans that were being promoted, and got us to a vaccination rate that actually topped San Francisco and our border community of Calexico, which for the infrastructure that we have is kind of hard. After that, we shifted towards economics and finance. Calexico is a city that has been on the number two worstly managed cities in as far as the statewide audit goes, a high risk city. Just this year, based on our work, Calexico, for the first time in 20 years, was taken off that list very beautifully in 2025. And, we've just held what we want to be a functioning Calexico. But closer to the end, of course, we have a recall that again turns turns the attention away from what are public policies to what are personal attacks and agendas with special interests attached to those things.
So going back to what you're saying about vaccination rates and I guess economic functioning, I'd love to hear
Hmm.
more about how did you make those two things happen? Because you're saying the vaccination rate was rivaling or topping San Francisco, and you were mentioning that was a quite an accomplishment considering the infrastructure. So I'd love to hear about that.
Well, it was a very political issue, and I think across all of those themes, and even looking nationally, it really is how a politician, how a community leader, how they're able to manage those topics, right? And our strategy has always been very level-headed with the people of Calexico, making information that comes out of the government bilingual, which was a huge point of contention all the way up into the recall. The fact that even in a border city like Calexico, we truly believe that everyone had the right to know what the public finances were, what is the political issue at hand, focusing on engagement. And our priorities around the campaign were pretty level headed with what the average citizen is experiencing, right? Kind of like Mondami in a sense of we were also there saying affordable housing, public transportation that actually picks you up and takes you to where you need to be. Um, we brought the issue of vaccinations to the home of the people and put it into their cultural context in a way that and partnered with local doctors directly as government agencies to create these mega clinics, to make contextualized campaigns that spoke to the community. And of course, that was a recipe for very high engagement in Calexico. And in our particular border context, we acknowledge that we're a border town, and apparently that seemed to be a very political issue as well. And by acknowledging that people are going to need a ride once they cross the border from Mexicali to get their vaccine, that there will be that person. All of those, being very realistic and inclusive about people's perspectives in your city is a recipe for good engagement, I believe.
And you were mentioning that some other aspects, in addition to vaccination. So it sounds like you're getting voters very much engaged. Is that also how you were able to push economic issues or the greater economic functioning?
Of the agenda, of course. I mean, it's, you know, I believe like now we're talking about like the Democratic Party and how the left operates. And sometimes the left is very shy, right? The left forgets that it's the majority, right? We were talking about direct progressive issues that were popular with the community. And when we were able to get a progressive majority in city council in 2022 with the re-election of myself and the election of council member Gilberto Manzanares, we took immediate action. We cleared a lot with eminent domain, a lot of controversy to build the county's largest transportation center just 3 blocks away from the border. I believe part of the engagement is when a government takes action, direct action is not beating around the bush on what they stand for, compromising too much of their political identity. And so, yes, we won and we lost with our flag, right? But we still are what we are, which is progressive Democrats that are worried about the prospects of working class families, understanding that we're in a Latino farm working hot desert and what that really means on a day-to-day to people, even when they walk out of their homes and touch that hot sidewalk, what that means for their heart, how they communicate, what their fears are, right? Because at the end of the day, when a special interest group wants to do their action, they're gonna do all of those things that I described, obviously for a different purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were not shy, and just like I was not shy about my gender identity throughout the process, despite accusations of me um, fooling, I guess, the population about my gender identity.
Fooling? What does that mean? You're being accused of fooling people?
Yes, that apparently I was not transitioning fast enough, I guess, once in a while, as opposed to come pretty as a girl in a dress.
Aren't girls allowed to wear boots?
That's what I thought.
Wow.
I
Okay.
I thought we won that right already.
I thought so. Yeah. Wow.
Um,
Not transitioning fast enough. Okay.
but yeah, I mean, that's the core essence of our journey. And, it ended in a recall that cost upwards of at least 100,000, which I was elected with $2,000. And then I believe the re-election was 4,000. But the resources that were mobilized against me
Mm-hmm.
were incredible. And kudos to the Republicans. And this is a point, I think this is the most important point as my perspective as a rural Latina that is transgender, that is in one of those purple counties, is that when it came to taking out myself
Mm-hmm.
um, as a transgender mayor, the California Republican Party at a statewide level mobilized everything they got. They identified the local leader, Maritza Hurtado, the conservative. They allied with her. They created a whole slate up until the state assembly member. And they really just used this whole, rallied the churches using the whole gender thing. And they were able to sweep all cities, districts, all the way up until flipping a state assembly member, first Republican in 20 years to win in Imperial County, um, and established a physical office in downtown Calexico. Something that I can say, and I'm a proud party member, not even a shadow or a whisper of the California Democratic establishment or even neighboring counties. The only one that was really there was the grassroots Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest. But when it came to party versus party, the Republicans took this race seriously as to the cultural effects it would have on the California landscape. And the Democratic Party, well, it failed to show up in more ways than just for my campaign. And it quite literally lost a whole county in 2024, right? Because they were too shy about defending a transgender woman. When, this transgender woman certainly garnered more votes than what I was recalled with by at least two to threefold.
Oh, maybe you can explain kind of the mechanics of the election in which the recall happened.
Absolutely. And this is more a little bit like statewide policy because I believe my particular recall made a lot of legislators kind of kind of warped their imagination of what the role of recall should play in state politics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the exact percentage, but essentially you have to get about 20% in signatures of the people that voted in the last election. So right off the bat, a minority of people can call a special election.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turned out in my particular recall, that exact same petition of like 20% were the exact same 20% that came out to vote and were the exact same 20% that were able to recall a person that garnered maybe 50% of the popular vote in the previous election, and then 70% in the one prior to that in some like obscure date. So, you know, obviously, if you're a minority party like the Republicans are in the state of California, or the white nationalist, or whatever minority group that your special interest group that you maybe an oil executive, oil lobby, you can really muscle your way through local elections when the democracy is idling in a midterm or something, right?
Right.
And it, of course, they leverage the recall process as a way to purchase elections that they may have lost, just based on the math of how much resources that you need. And, that's just something to think about because I think the recall has more pure intentions of it's supposed to be something that empowers a majority, not a minority.
I was just asking you about being able to cherry pick your voter base with recall elections, and you were just about to respond to that.
Yes, in a way, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, the rules are the rules. You are also dealing with a situation where you had an inactive Democratic Party, a Democratic Party that did not show up for this particular election. And I think that's important too, regardless of what the rules are. But to your main question, yes, absolutely. It creates a big loophole for moneyed minority interests to be able to essentially create their own opportunities to retake whether it's a school board or whatever local government fits their special interests at the moment.
Going back to what you're saying about the Democratic Party, because earlier you were saying the Republican Party of California, they took this very seriously and they put all their resources behind this recall effort, but you did not see like any signs of the state Democratic Party. Do you have thoughts about this as someone, I don't like, did you previously have a certain impression of the Democratic Party as a candidate who is a registered Democrat? And would you have, say, advice for your previous self with this knowledge?
I mean, it was disappointing, but unfortunately expected.
Okay.
Um, I don't think there would have been much that would have changed that
Hmm.
in a sense. It goes on to what's going on with the Democratic Party as a whole. I think the Republicans were able to squarely align with themselves and
Hmm.
recognize a local movement worth investing in. And The Democratic Party, unfortunately, continues to use some top down organizing, and I think that's a major critique that at the national level that voters have of our party,
Mm-hmm.
and it needs to change. Of course, I am still a registered Democrat, but it should be a test case for how seriously, as a blue state, we take Democrats in rural counties, like Imperial County. Sometimes we write them off because they're less rich, less populous, whatever it is, but increasingly the culture in those counties is important to the congressional map, for example, at the national level. Like we need to take those communities just on their own merit, seriously.
You were talking about the culture of those communities. Could you elaborate what you mean by that?
Well, the way that culture is influenced in these rural counties that sometimes feel like they're not part of the California dream. They don't feel like they have access to the same hospitals. They might not most of the people there, like my home county of Imperial, they can't go to school in Imperial County past a certain level, whether that's an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. So people feel excluded, and when they feel excluded from the majority party, well, they're going to defect and they're going to vote for the other guy to seek representation. And that is something that we can preempt, and is something, a project that is important to vulnerable groups within those communities, say trans women in Bakersfield or in Fresno. It's important that they have that kind of safety and representation. So yeah, it translates into outcomes for people's wellness, but it also translates into electoral outcomes as well, if you're talking strategically as a party.
Do you have advice for the California Democratic Party or the National Democratic Party?
Well, absolutely, which is why I'm, proudly a part of this party, is to provide those resources and that representation. Like, what else is there to say? We need a grassroots movement that does not exclude anybody. Sometimes in our own little liberal bubbles, like we forget that we're excluding a lot of people without access to those resources. And that's a fundamental thing and a fundamental approach that needs to change. And that's not to say that when you're adopting this grassroots mentality that you're leaving out trans people. On the contrary, you are uplifting that trans person that is out there in some haystack out there, some haystack county in the middle of California or this country. On the contrary, it's insisting passionately, not watering down your values to mimic, the reactionary. It is to cement yourself, cement that oasis of progressivism and safety in that rural county to cause sustainable cultural shift that will enable you to make the change that you need. So I do take offense that the Democratic Party thought that it was politically toxic to defend me because I was a transgender mayor. Also, a transgender economist that is better at money than the Republicans were, 100 million%. you know, and I just happen to be transgender. Yes, we have to put the culture war aside. We just have to win, put it aside, and get to the issues that are ravaging our communities a little bit more broadly, right? Because it's a very convenient distraction to the other side to bring those things up. I don't know if that advice is clear.
You're saying you have to be better at money than the other guy. Is that what you're saying?
But also, always, I mean,
Also be better, okay?
be better, and you don't have to sell yourself out. You don't have to water yourself down to win.
Candidates don't necessarily always talk about money. So I think that's a really interesting point. Are there ways in which, right, you were talking about the heat of the sidewalks that people are traversing and the immediate reality voters were facing. Were there things that you did to connect, say, abstract economic ideas to make them accessible just to your normal voter?
Yes, there was. I mean, there's a whole section of just educating the community on what their budget looks like, what it is, what it is that they want, and what are the things that need to happen in order to make that happen. Whether they're pro police, whether they just want a bus that runs down to their street, like get them to know what a sales tax is, how much money is in the reserve. The biggest thing that I would do as a mayor and also representing the city on the transportation commission in Imperial County was to just use my knowledge of logistics to understand where people are going within the city and make sure that they have a complete transportation package. We rolled out the first in the state microtransit service, Calexico on demand, which is essentially a public Uber that has been adopted in other communities that later expanded and evolved into a countywide Uber project, public Uber that started to address like the border traffic side. I got to tell the community that our little city of Calexico, 5% of its general budget, 5% of all the money that our city spends goes on traffic control for cars that are exiting the country, right? Which is ridiculous. Imagine like putting the weight of two countries on the shoulders of a city of like 40,000 people, right?
Wow.
Yes, $1 million a year that should be going to parks. Well, I think that's like half of our public works, funds. Getting them to know like structurally, like what is possible, what we need, what does zoning look like. Zoning is a big issue right now, and a hot issue in Imperial County with the data center that they're proposing. It's hard to describe because there's no one method to go from the bus, the microtransit, what you interact with, the sales tax that you pay.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have a hard time understanding magnitudes and percentages. Some people don't have the time, and that's okay. You have to meet people where they're at, and you can always learn something from them, right? What is it that they're missing? People are usually very honest to tell you the things that are going wrong, and a person has to have the attitude of like, okay, you're gonna come at me with a whole bunch of complaints about very complicated things, and I have to come up with complicated and creative and direct solutions that are going to respond directly to you on a short term, keep you happy, and on a long term, give you hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to understand the whole municipal budget to understand those things. I think that's unfortunately unrealistic, right? Even if you were able to, I don't think anybody wants to, right? That's okay. That's why you take an office and you do a job, right? But there's some basic elements of give and receive, of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of concepts and interchange of tell me what it is that you need. I'll try to explain to you in the simplest of way where we're at with that and what we can do about it in the language that
Okay.
people speak.
Mhm. How old are you now?
I'm 28 years old.
Okay, so we're in 2026. So you were like 22 when you took.
I, yeah, I was 22 when I graduated and ran for Calexico City Council.
Was running for mayor like at any time before, right? Because you explained how you made that decision, but was that even like a glimpse of your eye before 20?
No,
No.
and no, 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 absolutely. I have been in politics and in various capacities when I was like 13, 15, like endorsing candidates and helping people with their campaigns locally. But nothing had motivated me to say, "Oh, I'm going to run," as much as getting off that plane, seeing how people were dying, understanding why they were not being represented, and then seeing the same cycle about to repeat itself in front of you with this Morris Risen running unopposed. It was that moment of, oh, hell no. We're not
Okay.
going to just let this happen.
Looking back, and you're only 28, but if you look back at your time in office and have like a favorite moment that made it all worth your while, what would you want to share with us? Like, what makes public service so great?
It's still ongoing. When I go back home, like I did over Christmas, months after the recall, with much drama in between, just driving by that $18 million multimodal transit center in the middle of downtown Calexico, 3 blocks away from the border, actually being constructed. I believe, like 500 units of affordable housing on the west side of Calexico, literally just driving past all of those projects that made it through the BS of politics, that in 1 year time were a part of, maybe what others don't understand was a quadrupling of the city's capital improvement budget in 1 year. Maybe people are not able to quantify or understand that, but all of us, when we drive by what are going to be, in my view, in my eyes, monuments to community, living monuments to community well-being, that makes it worth it. And obviously, the moments that I spend with Mexicali Mayor Norma Bustamante, modeling binational collaboration between sister cities on the border, being able to celebrate LGBT pride as a united border community, not just the historic raising of the pride flag in Calexico, which is the first one in Imperial County, but the binational pride parade that we had in our sister city of Mexicali as well, were uh, amazing. And the last one, I think that speaks very special to my heart, is important to me, is when Esperanza, her name is Hope Esperanza Colio, was hired as city manager, as the first Mexican-born woman that was born in Mexicali, city manager, first woman to manage our city, when she was sworn in to her office. A woman that had hit the glass ceiling when she tried to become the CEO of Imperial County, a woman who is now the CEO of San Benito County, to, as a young woman, still have been there to be the person that helped an older woman, a cisgender woman, who supported me as a trans woman, to break her glass ceiling. That was everything to me. Because, and it's not just about the representation. And I said in that meeting, when she was hired publicly, I said, the representation is not in who you are, right, in those boxes that you check off. Is what the boxes that you check off mean to you and experience, and how you're going to manage this city. And that is exactly what it was. A woman that would wake up at 3 in the morning, and I was there with her, actually going through dollar by dollar that whole municipal budget, projecting out for 5 years, and showing the world that women run things very, very well. Um, Working alongside Gloria Romo, who didn't speak English and was the vice mayor. All of that combined, all of that, those three elements, I would have done it all over again in the same way. Not even, it would, it still doesn't matter that people have tried to end my life, have planted a bomb in my house, have disrespected me, have done whatever they have done. The history has been written, and great things were brought to the city of Calexico that are going to outlast me. Mega public infrastructure that is going to be there for 10 to 30 years, revitalizing a community, of course. And we will have a chance to re enter that political scene sometime in the future. That is what was most beautiful, I think, about that experience.
I was just trying not to cry while I was listening to you. Wow. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Raul Urena, former mayor of Calexico, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share your journey with us.
Absolutely. A great pleasure and a big hug to everybody here in the Bay. Thank you.
All astronomical observatories catch waves, irregular waves that might have been sent from outer space.
Some signals are hard to explain. This one comes from Santa Cruz, KSQD, K-Squid, 90.7 FM, community radio for Earth and beyond.
I'm Meilin Obinata. You're listening to Talk of the Bay, and my next guest is Peter Salai, a District 5 voter in the city of Salinas, who is sharing his thoughts about the censure of City Council member Andrew Sandoval. Hi, Peter. Maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yes, good morning. Hi, I'm Peter Salai. I'm a resident of North Salinas, and my family's been here for about over 50 years, and I'm a constituent of Andrew Sandoval.
Did you vote for him?
I did, and provided some funds for his campaign and had his signs in my yard.
What are your thoughts about his social media posts?
Well, they're a little conflicted. On the one hand, I don't think that they're particularly malicious or mean-spirited. I think in many ways they're kind of silly. Some of them tend to be sarcastic. I think technically they violate the rules of decorum, which he agreed to. Everybody has to agree to certain ethical standards of how you're going to, conduct yourself. But, is it egregious? Is it worthy of censure? I don't think so.
In your mind, in your experience, have you observed some kind of censure which you thought was worthy?
Well, I think you'd have to go way across the bounds, where you are, using, inappropriate language or offensive language, or you're attacking somebody on immutable characteristics, or, it's clearly, bullying or stalking, or, behaviors that we would recognize as just beyond the pale, racist, or, misogynistic, or, something against somebody's sexual orientation or whatever, something that I think an ordinary person would recognize as, wow, that's way beyond the pale. But the kind of videos that Andrew produces are more, I think, political in nature. I think they're more annoying. I just don't think that they rise to the level of censure. Technically, they're against the way the rules of decorum are written. But in my view, I would not vote for censure.
So, when you heard about the censure hearing, what was your reaction?
Well, I think it's part of a political competition that's going on between the two sides. On the one side, you have 5 people that ran as a slate. They were very open about it. They were heavily funded by Big Ag. And on the other side, you had people who were more community-based and less tied to business interests. And so the 5 people who ran as a slate were victorious. They won 4 council seats in the mayorship, and they made it quite clear that they were going to govern in a different way. Their whole campaign rested on charges of dysfunction of the previous council, and there were certain things they did not like in terms of support for the police, for example. And so the 2 council members that remained that were not up for election, they represented the older council, the previous council. So you have 5 against 2. And so the first thing that the victorious group did was to, what it looks like, initiate a recall attempt against Andrew Sandoval. And so the same donors that paid for their campaign also paid for a recall attempt. So if I was Andrew Sandoval, what that signal to me would be this incoming group not interested in working with the people who were there. They wanted to get rid of Andrew. And, if I were Andrew, I would feel a little defensive as well. I'd be like, what the hey? shouldn't we all be working as a team? The incoming folks and the people who are already here. But so to me, that poisoned the well, and we've had basically a perpetual campaign. The campaign never ended.
Did you happen to catch any of the censure hearing on Tuesday evening?
Oh yeah, I was there for the whole 3.5 hours.
What were your impressions of the hearing?
Well, 95% of the people who were there to support Andrew, and it was seen more in terms of what kind of a person, Andrew was. Was he a good person? Was he a good representative? Did he have the interests of his constituents at heart? And, most people would agree with that. Even the people who were in favor of the censure agreed to that. And then I think most people saw this not so much as a censure, but as an exercise of censorship, that his First Amendment rights to express himself were being censored. And they are opposed to that. And they also see, big ag as not serving, the little man, the ordinary person. And Andrew is seen more as his supporting the ordinary folks, especially through his leadership on the petition drive for the rent stabilization efforts to get the repeal of the repealed, and then to have it placed on the ballot in November. So in some ways, the effort to make Sandoval look bad blew up in their faces. In my estimation, it helped him be reelected in November. I don't think if these five thought that censure was going to change his behavior or weaken him politically, I don't think they succeeded in that. I think they did the opposite.
So after the vote, which was, I guess the majority of votes went for the censure, what message does that send to voters of Salinas, or to you?
Well, to me, I felt it diminished the city. It diminished everybody who's involved. I did not think it was positive whatsoever. It shows that the entire city council, all of our leadership, are distracted with an issue or politics that is not in service of the residents. The next day, potholes remain. Broken sidewalks remain. Roads that are in bad shape remain. We have homeless folks that are still, have encampments in various parts of our city. We have businesses that remain vacant, like the old orchards and the Shell station on Main and Laurel. I mean, all of economic development, housing, all these issues remain, and censure did not move any of those issues forward. And so they need to be working together. In the Monterey County Weekly, there was an article about housing, and it talked about how the permit center here in Salinas is seen as being obstructionist, as having barriers, so that developers don't want to build here because they have to deal with the permit center. Well, okay, the council should be working on that. Well, are there things that we can do to help developers build here so that we can address the housing shortage in other ways besides rent stabilization efforts?
If you don't mind, just for listeners, would you like to characterize like your politics? Because so far you haven't said anything very radical in any particular direction. So just so that we can understand.
So I tend to be, more in the middle. I don't tend to be a Democrat or a Republican. I tend to be annoyed by both sides many times.
Okay.
I find myself, more of a negative voter than a positive voter in terms of voting against the worst person than for the best person, and so I tend to be more of a pragmatist and not an ideologue, So, I have definite strong opinions about certain issues that might land me on one side or the other, but it would be a mistake to characterize me as being totally in favor of that particular side's whole agenda, So sometimes I get mischaracterized because I might be, for example, the whole rent stabilization, rent control issue is very problematic because most research shows that it has the opposite effect of what they want, which is, you want more housing and you want rents to go down. So, would I vote for rent stabilization and rent control? Probably not. But does that mean therefore I'm, a Republican? No, it does not mean that. It means it's a difficult issue.
So, any other thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I like Sandoval, and I will continue to vote for him. I don't regret my vote for him. I've told him, he's responsive. He's done a heck of a lot more than the two previous council members that I was familiar with and I interacted with. He'll return phone calls. He returns emails. If I ask him to work on an issue that's important to me, or if a neighbor comes to me and asks for help and I call Sandoval and I ask him, well, look, can you help out here? He responds. And, he's not perfect, but then who is, I wish he would not, put these things on the social media. If I were the District 5 representative, I would not use social media in that way. Gloria De La Rosa and Margaret DiRigio and some of the others, they have told him directly that, they don't like it. It hurts their feelings. It's, they feel bullied. And sometimes, even if your intent is not, to bully somebody or to hurt their feelings or whatever, and that's how they receive it, you have to take that into consideration, especially if you're a public official. And I was happy to hear that Sandoval, when he defended himself, he was given 24 minutes to defend himself. He did say that he agreed that his behavior, violated the rules of decorum. And he acknowledged that, in one particular video that he would not do a certain thing again. So I'm thinking that maybe the whole experience caused maybe some reflection, and maybe we'll see more of his videos tailored towards what he claims he's trying to do, which is to inform people, make the proceedings of the city council more accessible, especially to younger people who are on social media. I think if he tailors it more to, getting information out, and he can be critical, if somebody takes a stand or a vote that he disagrees with on a policy basis, but not to make it, what it seems like a little bit, personal. I think he can be effective and non-offensive.
Okay, I actually do have one more question for you. Before, you were mentioning that your family has been in Salinas for 50 years. How would you describe your experiences in terms of civic engagement? Have you been like a very active voter or someone very actively paying attention to local politics?
I always vote. I vote in every election, regardless. I don't vote for every issue. If I don't have an opinion on a particular ballot, I'll leave it blank. But generally, I educate myself. I vote in every election. I think it's a responsibility of citizenship to vote. And so in terms of local politics, I was not particularly interested in local politics. I was interested in the national scene more. But since I've moved back to Salinas to help take care of my mom after my father passed away 6-7 years ago, I've become interested in local politics, mainly through, my mom's eyes. She would ask me, well, our street is in disrepair. And, I lived in Washington State for a quarter of a century. And I would say, well, there has to be a public works department. And there's got to be like a schedule of, when they repave streets or do maintenance. And so, that's kind of how I started to get involved. I would call somebody and I would say in the city, well, can you give me an idea? Like, for example, we would go on walks and we would encounter horrible upheaved sidewalks that were a danger, to them, both my mom and my dad when he was still here, because they would use a walker, for example. And it was dangerous for them, because they might fall or, because the ground was uneven. And I would, access how the city, all right, you need to put in a request for service. All right. And then I get an automatic message back that says, your request for service on this sidewalk repair has been received and you are scheduled, and I'm not making this up. If you think I'm going to exaggerate right now, I'm not making it up, 22 years from now. And that made me think, this is ridiculous. This is not right. And so, that was kind of my and so that's when I started to contact people like Christy Cromines, who was my previous representative, and then Kimberly Craig, who was also a previous. And I said to them, well, look, what the heck's going on here, And I got unsatisfactory answers. And so when Andrew Sandoval ran for the second time, because the first time he ran against Cromines, he got defeated. But the second time he ran, I was more tuned in. And so I contacted him and I said, well, what is your position on roads and infrastructure and sidewalks and all that kind of, because that's kind of what, I was most interested to begin with. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so, that's kind of what, I was most interested to begin with. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so, that's kind of what, I was most interested to begin with. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so, that's kind of what, I was most interested to begin with. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority for him. And so he was very clear that this was a high priority and he highlighted it in his campaign. So I said, okay, you've got my vote. Here's some money and bring me a sign.
How's he doing on, I guess, roads and so on? Like, are you
Well,
still
no,
getting tickets that are giving you dates for 22 years in the future?
oh no. They've changed that. The previous city council moved towards, instead of being reactionary. So, for example, there's a road in our neighborhood, Pueblo, that got a gutter-to-gutter repaving, and it's not a through street. Nobody drives on that road. And when I asked, I said, well, why on earth would you use limited asphalt and limited resources for a road that nobody uses? And the answer was, well, they received the most complaints from residents on that road. And I said, well, that's idiotic. There needs to be a process where you look at roads that are heavily traveled and are poor shape, and then you kind of look in the 6 districts to make sure that not all of the resources of the city are going to one particular district. I mean, there might be a little bit of unevenness there because there might be a greater need in some districts than other, but you don't, everybody pays taxes and everybody should see the city addressing concerns, and everybody has poor roads. So there needs to be some equity in that regard. It doesn't need to be a perfect equity, but there needs to be some. And so the city has moved in that direction, and also in how they do sidewalks. So they have gone more towards what I would consider to be a rational criterion-based approach rather than so many people, if you have a lot of complainers or people who know how to access or comfortable in accessing the city resources, then you get more services. No, that's not right. That's discriminatory. It's unfair. That's not right. So the city has moved. They've gone away from you're on the list. That's the system they had before, to a more logical approach. Where you do an inventory and you do a census of your roads. What do they look like, and you have criteria. And then you can prioritize. In terms of use and condition. And location. And so, if it's closer to schools, or like when they do disability ramps, for example, where are they in terms of where schools are, or where seniors live, or, medical places or whatever. Have some logical basis.
So I take it it's very different from what you were experiencing 7 or 8 years ago. Does this experience with, say, road repair, does that make you want to be more engaged with local matters? Because you were saying
Yes.
you're kind of
Yes.
seeing it through your mother's or your parents' side.
Right.
What's your
Right.
perspective now?
Well, now I'm involved, independently. So, I go to city council meetings or I watch them on YouTube. Andrew put me on the Measure G committee, which is a tax oversight committee. And so, and I engage frequently, directly with the mayor, directly with the city council, directly with city staff. When there's an issue that interests me, like traffic calming. I reviewed their policy, and I had some suggestions on how to improve it. Or there's a proposed rec center at Northgate Park that I've gone to the feasibility study meetings and look through their proposals, and I have views. And so I've gone to planning commission meetings, I've gone to traffic and transportation committee meetings, I've gone to library and community services meetings, commission meetings, to to offer suggestions or to educate myself, so that I can speak intelligently when I make a recommendation. I'm nobody special. I'm just an ordinary person. But I think that the city needs to hear from ordinary people. And they don't have to do what I say necessarily, but they at least have to, take into consideration, here's at least how one person sees, what they're doing or what they're trying to do. I'm trying to be helpful, is all I'm trying to do. Because it's our city, right? And so hopefully, we're all working together to improve it.
You sound extremely passionate about what happened. So you said that I think you said you were retired, but it sounds
Right.
like you're very engaged. So
Right.
it sounds like it's a fulfilling experience.
It is. Well, I care about our city. I live here, and I would like it to be as good as it can be.
What advice would you give to other voters who want to get more involved?
Well, our city I think they've done a good job. They have a website. They put all of their meetings on YouTube. There's all these different commissions, like the police and the library and, traffic, like I mentioned. There's ways to get involved. If you can't necessarily get an appointment, you can at least, be aware of what's going on. I find that people tend to be relatively good at being responsive, although I think we can make improvements on that. And so I think they're trying. I think the leaders and I think they're trying to be responsive and open. So I think that's encouraging. So I think there are opportunities there if people are interested.
Well, thank you so much, Peter.
Sure, anytime.
Hi, everybody. You're listening to KSQD at 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM, and on your smart device at ksqd.org, and on our app, downloadable from Google Play and Apple, the Apple App Store, and anywhere you use your smart devices.